This is the story of Vladimir Putin's global campaign of targeted assassination. This is about how the Russian state goes after enemies, traitors, critics, journalists, those who seek to expose Vladimir Putin's links to organised crime. It's a story about intimidation, it's a story of statecraft, and it's one of the most disturbing geopolitical stories of our time. My name is Heidi Blake, and I'm Global Investigations Editor at BuzzFeed News. And I wrote From Russia with Blood, the Kremlin's ruthless assassination programme and Vladimir Putin's secret war on the West. Back in 2014, I flew to New York to meet with Mark Schoofs, who was then the editor of BuzzFeed's Global Investigations team. And I was talking to him about setting up an investigations team in the United Kingdom. And I took with me a news clipping that I hoped contained the clues to a mystery that maybe the new team could set about trying to solve. And that news clipping was about the death of a man called Scott Young. He was a multi-millionaire property tycoon, and he had plunged to his death days before I flew to New York, falling from the fourth floor of a London penthouse, and had been impaled on the spikes of a wrought iron fence underneath his window. And so it was a really gruesome death.
Scott Young's body was found in Montague Square on Monday evening.
There were reports about his death, and particularly about his connections to a number of other men who had died in suspicious circumstances, including the exiled Russian oligarch Boris Berezovsky. And so I was really intrigued by what kind of lay behind this web of death at the heart of London. And shortly after, I got a mysterious phone call out of the blue from somebody who asked me to come and meet her at an address in a smart part of London. I turned up at the address, and the door swung open, and I came face to face with Michelle Young, who was the wife of Scott Young, and who told me her husband had been murdered, and she wanted my new team to investigate.
I knew as soon as I had received that phone call, I knew that he'd been murdered.
Michelle Young had a trove of documents which had come out in the course of this divorce battle between her and Scott Young, and those documents showed really fascinating new details about Young's business dealings with Boris Berezovsky, this exiled Russian oligarch who was a major enemy of the Kremlin, and with a number of other highly politically exposed Russians who were really living in the UK in the crosshairs of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And so we began to look at those documents and to piece together this jigsaw puzzle which connected Scott Young not only to Boris Berezovsky, who himself had been found hanged in very strange circumstances the year before, but also to a whole group of people, a total of 14 men who had died suspiciously in Britain after falling foul of Vladimir Putin. We got hold of this huge cache of documentary evidence which showed the connections between this group of men who had all worked together to try to move ill-gotten Russian money into the United Kingdom and had all met untimely ends. And we fed all of those documents, along with huge amounts of other exclusive material we obtained, into a custom-built database that allowed us to search across the whole set of data that we'd obtained. And we also then scraped public records from various court cases and public inquiries and inquests. We were able to piece together a kind of big digital library which helped us to unravel this story of Russian-related money and betrayal and murder. We also got hold of hours worth of surveillance footage of Scott Young and some of his associates in the months leading up to his death, some leaked audio recordings. We rebuilt mobile phones and computers that had been discarded to piece together a really large digital cache of evidence. And we got hold of some bags of evidence which the police had gathered from the scenes of some of these deaths and which had been discarded. And we were able to piece together this picture of a pattern of 14 suspicious deaths in the United Kingdom.
Officially, Thames Valley Police are treating the death as unexplained, but there is no shortage of conspiracy theories surrounding it.
People fell off tall buildings, they were found hanged, found stabbed to death, fell under tube trains. There was a whole series of bizarre and grisly deaths that befell these men. At the same time, Berezovsky was financing a group of people to investigate Vladimir Putin's links to organised crime and his connections to a series of terror atrocities that had taken place in Russia. And those investigators similarly died in highly suspicious circumstances, both in Britain and in Russia.
I was threatened with the murder of my 6-year-old son.
The most famous of those cases is the death of Alexander Litvinenko, who was a defector, a former Russian spy who came to the UK and blew the whistle on lots of atrocities connected to the Kremlin. That's probably the most famous Russian assassination in living memory. He was poisoned with radioactive polonium, a deadly nuclear substance, and he died very slowly and painfully in a London hospital, but not before solving his own murder from his deathbed and accusing the Kremlin of his killing.
Friends and relatives gathered to pay their respects to a man noted for his vigour and challenge to the Putin administration.
Russia, and particularly under Vladimir Putin, has ploughed a huge amount of resource into refining the art and the science of targeted assassination to enable Russian assassins to kill enemies of the state abroad without leaving a trace in undetectable ways.
News that a nerve agent was used in the attack on Sergei Skripal and his 33-year-old daughter is making headlines in Britain.
But also, they have the ability to conduct very high-profile assassinations that are pretty obviously connected to Russia if they want to send a message. And so you can see with the recent attack on Sergei Skripal, a Russian defector in Britain. He was poisoned in Salisbury with a deadly nerve agent called Novichok. That's a substance that really only originates in those quantities in Russia. It's a very conspicuously Russian poison. There are a lot more subtle ways within the armory of the Russian state to kill people.
In this park, he and his daughter were attacked in broad daylight with a lethal chemical.
Widespread speculation that the Russian state was involved.
Instead, there was a choice taken to use this extremely conspicuous technique of killing, and really that attack was intended to send a message to traitors that if you cross Vladimir Putin, your life is in danger.
What happened here pitted East against West with a chemical weapon of choice.
There's a whole array of techniques available, ranging from those kinds of really sophisticated methods just to very crude organised crime style gangland shootings and stabbings. And because of that real full spectrum of techniques being used by the Russian state to neutralise enemies, it's quite difficult for law enforcement to say with certainty whether a suspicious death was carried out by the security services or organised crime or was a natural death, and that's part of why these deaths have been so difficult for the authorities to tackle and investigate. Western leaders have shown themselves to be really unwilling to stand up to the Kremlin in these cases where Putin's enemies have died suspiciously on Western soil. My team at BuzzFeed News spent about 2 years investigating these deaths in Britain and one death in the USA before we published our articles in the summer of 2017, exposing this web of death in both countries and also the failure of the authorities to investigate properly or to tackle the threat from Russia. Certainly reporting this story was dicey for us at times. We had some strange occurrences, reporters being followed and items being moved around inside people's homes and things like that. And that kind of thing is obviously intimidating, but we have an amazing security team at BuzzFeed News who worked really hard to keep us safe throughout the investigation. We used counter-surveillance methods and trackers and panic alarms and things like that to keep us safe. I don't think this story is over. I think that all the evidence suggests that Putin's campaign of targeted assassination is, if anything, escalating. Just a week after the attack on the Skripals in Salisbury, another enemy of the Kremlin died on British soil, a man named Nikolai Glushkov, who was found strangled at home with a dog's lead. That is a case that the British authorities did immediately treat as a murder, I think because the attack on the Skripals had been such a watershed moment. But there's really no sign that this problem is abating. If anything, this is an escalating problem.